Authors Over 50, Writing in Life's Sweetest Third. Authors Over 50's weekly podcast celebrates writers and their journeys to publication. Writing after 50 is a whole story on its own, so let's skip to life's sweetest third and talk with authors about their journey from pen to publish. Welcome, I'm Julia Daly, your host, and I invite you to listen to interviews with writers who've achieved their goal of publishing a book just later in life. We've seen award lists for under 30 or under 40, but I've yet to see lists for those who've achieved a significant milestone of their own, launching a new career and publishing their first book after the age of 50. We will hear about these authors' inspirations, struggles, strategies, and the smell of that first book. These writers' journeys inspire me because I'm one of them. My guest today is a psychoanalyst and a psychologist in private practice, a nonfiction author, a novelist, and a public speaker. She earned her Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Columbia University and a post-doctorate certificate in psychoanalysis. As a nonfiction author, her articles have appeared in the Washington Post, on the Wall Street Journal's website, and on NBC.com, among other outlets. Her articles for the website of Psychology Today have been viewed and shared close to 1 million times. Her book, Mad Men on the Couch, analyzed the subconscious motivations of Don Draper and other Mad Men characters. It was named one of the top 10 performing arts books of the year by Publishers Weekly. Welcome to Authors Over 50, Dr. Stephanie Newman.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Stephanie, our opening question on Authors Over 50 is always, what took you so long to write your first book?
Well, I have to say that as a psychologist and also someone with a family, you maybe have a lot of different balls in the air. And so I'm a hybrid in the sense that I would work all day and then think about writing projects at night. And the novel that I wrote when I was over 50, although of course I'm 21 years old, as you are, right? The novel I wrote, Barbarians at the PTA, was something I felt I had a story I had to tell and a conversation I wanted to start. And it just happened from there. It made me write it in a way.
I hear a lot of authors say that. They say the characters just came to them and made them put the words on the paper.
Right.
Your premise to take a show like Mad Men and analyze the characters is fascinating. What gave you this idea?
Well, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, and it said that you can understand psychopathology by understanding archetypes in literature. So whether literature is Winnie the Pooh with Eeyore being, a character and Eeyore was depressed, or narcissism with Scarlett O'Hara, showing how she would externalize it and never take blame. And I thought, you could do this with the book Mad Men.
Well, you certainly have a rich environment with all the shows on television today. Do you have to have any kind of licensing permission? How does that work?
No. It wasn't done with the studio, but it was just written a psychologist's opinion about the characters.
Well, I know I used a few song lyrics in my novels, and I had to pay the companies that own the rights. So will you be able to use this type of premise again with other shows?
I haven't. I transitioned to writing a novel, and that's my most recent work that just came out. And so you could probably put something on the couch in the sense that you could put depression on the couch or anxiety on the couch or a popular TV show, that everyone's talking about. you could, do the election on the couch. I didn't do any of those things. I tried to, again, get a conversation started about some events that go on in various families and people's lives, using my background, but also fictionalizing or trying to explain in a way that would be accessible to people.
Well, Stephanie, that would be a great podcast for you. You could start your own podcast by analyzing all the books and television shows.
That's exciting. Maybe you can be my my navigator.
That would be fun. Once you knew you had to write your first book, how did you proceed? Did you search for an agent? Did you decide to use a hybrid, a small press, or did you self-publish?
So I've done a couple of things, but I would say that people who do any kind of nonfiction are fortunate because you can get published somewhere, whether you write an opinion piece, whether you write a service piece for a magazine or a website talking about, and psychology is such a broad domain that you can you could have a viewpoint or discuss a lot of things. And so it wasn't that hard to write. And Psychology Today asked me to become a blogger and gave me a column or a blog. And then from there, I could say to somebody who was an agent, I'm interested in doing a book and here are some things I've written. And they, I think that probably wasn't the case 15, 20 years ago. People couldn't just have a blog and have clips. The clips had to be in magazines. So that was great. And that's an option open to people. And then I was able with an agent to a few times to get traditional book deals, where the agent does a little auction and publishers, some step out and some make a bid, and they, somebody in the case of each of the books that I'm talking about today, somebody bid on them and we took the bid, and they were published by, I guess what you would say, a St. Martin's Press, which was the Mad Men book, is an independent, well-known, well thought of press, and Skyhorse is an arm of Simon and Schuster, a small but independent part of a traditional publisher. So they use their distribution networks and everything, but they have their own team that picks the books or edits them or distributes them or whatever.
So many of us use real people to inspire our characters. Do you constantly have to tell your clients you aren't writing about them?
Such a good question, because there are psychologists or others, therapists, who have written things, and I don't write about patients. And I guess it's fine if you get, if you get people to sign a consent form, you are able to do that. I think it has an impact on the treatment. So if I'm a therapist first, a psychologist first, I don't discuss anything. And in fact, anything I'm writing with fiction too, people always say, is that about me? Is that about your neighbor? And the answer is fiction is really fiction. It's really about no one. It's really written to get a conversation started, or to bring light to some important issues, bullying or how parents parent and leave out other parents or kids, or how, what's the word I'm looking for? Homogeneous certain neighborhoods could be, but not true. There's no character, Don Draper in Mad Men was fictional. The characters in my novel are made up. Even though there's a psychologist in it, I don't write about patients. The patients come first, and they're in a separate little box, and there's confidentiality. Otherwise, you cannot really conduct treatment, and people couldn't open up to you.
Your second book, Barbarians at the PTA, is called Desperate Housewives Meets Mean Girls, and you address cyberbullying. Tell us more about that.
Sure. Again, I thought that there were a lot of people having a similar conversation, whether I was supervising a trainee in California, even though I'm on the East Coast, or speaking to a friend who lived in another country, or having coffee in my kitchen with somebody local. people were talking about very similar things. And I thought, hey, this is an opportunity to talk about a universal, a phenomenon that people can relate to and get a conversation started. So I thought I would write about it, and it ended up being fun. And anytime I did a book group, and anytime I've done any speaking engagement, anything like that, it is inevitable that people will say, oh God, I don't really talk about this that much, but when my daughter was in 8th grade or my son was in 10th grade, a lot of people can relate to it. And then it touches upon their own childhoods and how they didn't feel like part of the group, or they were uncomfortable socially. And then that, of course, informs how they parent. So, it cuts deep.
It really does, and so pertinent these days. And I can just imagine that issue is a great topic with your book to discuss at book clubs.
People do love to read parenting type mom action stories about parenting. I joke parenting as a contact sport because the level of competition, this could be the Super Bowl with the way these people strategize and elbow and pick the carpool, and the parents are making these decisions. And it's so often the kids are the collateral damage. It's so not necessary. And I think kids and parents are separate. And that's what I tell people when I'm consulting as a psychologist. The kids should be left to their own devices to pick their own friends. Obviously, if a kid is really in jeopardy of hurting themselves or something, a parent should get involved and call a doctor. Or I don't mean that, though. I mean, in the regular old social landscape, kids should be allowed to make mistakes and pick their own friends. And if they're not invited to the party, disappointment's inevitable. It's really what you make of it that matters. So just teach your kids about being resilient or finding a backup, or if they're not part of the group, they can solve it and make new friends or something. Kids want to be popular. Kids want to be friends with certain people. There's so many lessons you could teach.
I like to hear that because I watch my grandchildren. We want to be helicopter grandparents or parents, but they really can figure it out and be stronger individuals because of it.
I think that would be a really interesting article, a helicopter grandparent. That's really fun. I leave that to you, Julia.
We writers like to sit in our offices and write, and we don't always like to get out and market ourselves. Have you found any publicity or marketing that worked, or maybe even that didn't, that you can tell people about?
Well, you can write a book about how I've never experienced in my entire life rejection like I have as an author. And I'm not, this is not a sad story. The book is in bookstores. The book did fine. There's nothing like that, but it was easier with Mad Men because once that show was on the air, you could really, the publicity people at St. Martin's could easily say to a newspaper, Mad Men's premiere is Tuesday night. I have, this book about it, and they might cover it. And that wasn't terribly hard. But in terms of personally, you scramble, you try to get op-eds published. Promoting a book during the pandemic was not, there was a social media blackout when my novel came out. And there were very important social issues that trumped any sort of novel release. And, people just didn't have the headspace to think about mothering, bullying. People were thinking about staying alive. They were thinking about the amazing tensions in our country and government. There were so many other things that were going on. There was a tremendous explosion in terms of the movement Black Lives Matter, and people were not focusing on promoting a novel and having you as a guest on their morning show or something. There were just other things people were discussing. So it was sort of like screaming into a hurricane. Hi, I have this book. Yeah, no one cared. That said, local bookstores were happy to have a local author. Book clubs were happy to have someone talk about these because I think it's called evergreen, certain issues like bullying or cliques or parenting, overzealous parenting, or whatever. All those things, can come up year after year. There's a little love story too. There's mother-daughter, exploration of mother-daughter, and certainly screen time. There's so many issues that can come up over and over again. So I could do some local events and there were a couple of online publications that called it a read, the read, one of the reads of the month. And that was very nice. And any kind of magazine article I could write or get published, or advice I could give as a psychologist. So there were opportunities. It was just hard. It was an uphill battle during the pandemic, but during the week, June, the first week of June, when the pandemic was really at its, people were not thinking about a little novel, or there were no in-person events. So you couldn't have a book party, things that you do. You could just do, there's a lot of very amazing opportunities now in Bookstagram or Book Talk, where social media allows people to connect with readers and with influencers in a way that's really special. If, not podcasts like this one, but any way that people could do virtual events, I think was open to authors in the past few years. And maybe it wasn't so current before. And that's been a nice opportunity for people.
Were people surprised with your credentials that you wrote a work of fiction? Did they just expect you to write nonfiction?
They do. And I do get a lot of, for people from the town where I live, am I in this? No, you're not in it. It's a novel. These are made up characters. And also, I think patients know that I just wouldn't do that. But people do say, oh, do you write about your patients? Especially because a few people have written books where they have discussed patients. But again, that's a whole different thing, where you let them know, you get a consent, and then you write about it and you call it nonfiction. This was a whole made up thing. And again, people in Mad Men are fictional. They're made up by somebody else, Matthew Weiner, that was so, but yes, with the novel, people would ask me that.
Well, why don't you read a few paragraphs for us to hear your tone and voice in the book you brought to share? You can set it up and let us know where you're going to begin.
Sure. I'll just start from the beginning so people can hear. It's just the easiest. Chapter 1 starts with it's called Best Day. I've always told, it's about a psychologist, a single mom and her daughter who move unexpectedly to a small insular suburb in Westchester County. Fiction. I've always told my therapy patients that endings are inevitable. It's best to understand feelings and move on without looking back. Having survived my share of losses and goodbyes, I knew that as soon as one door closed, another opened. Those were heavy thoughts for Tuesday at 8 a.m., but Rachel was starting a new elementary school. Transitions were on my mind. I headed down the hallway, wood floors creaking, causing my heart to do a little butterfly flip. It had only been a couple of weeks, and I still hadn't adjusted to all the sounds and scents. Our new house was full of them, and who knew what else? Well, what did I expect? The place was built before women had the right to vote. Rachel's room looked like a disaster relief site with cartons and cast-off clothing at every turn. She sat on the bed, staring into her laptop, a photo of several girls at a back-to-school picnic. I glanced at her leggings and t-shirt. They were identical to those in the picture. My little Margaret Mead conducting field research on her first day of her new school. Come on, Rach, let's get going. So that's the first few paragraphs. I don't know how much you want me to go, but it's hopefully bringing people into the action of the first day of a new school when you're in 5th grade. The mom, the daughter, how it feels to be in a new house, a new school, what will happen.
I love that. And I love how you touched on girls dressing alike. I think you've written about that as well.
You're absolutely right. That was a piece that people were really interested in. Teen girls do that to reflect, to mirror each other, mirroring the function that caregivers provide when they look down and a baby's looking up, a newborn, and the baby goes like, ah, and the caregiver goes back, goo, 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 and the baby goes, goo, goo, goo. And, they see in your eye, the gleam that you think they're the greatest baby in the world. And over time, millions of moments like that, millions or thousands, or that's how a person begins to feel in their own skin, like they feel good about themselves. They begin to develop esteem. And I argued that when teen girls dress like their friends or preteens, it's similar to the mother-child mirroring function of, oh, she looks like me, I look like her, back, radiate that good feeling. We're part of something. We're good inside. We're like each other. Because adolescence is a fraught time. It doesn't feel so great.
It's so yes. Interesting to me.
Thank you. I think it's interesting too. I think teenagers are really interesting, and people's use of clothing or people's psychology and how personality is built up and how people identify with others, and that becomes part of their personality. All, I agree, very interesting, complicated.
Very. Do you make time to read for pleasure? And if so, what genres?
Oh, I do. I always have a romance that I'm reading, which it's just my escape. It's like having an ice cream sundae, like, and sitting in the bathtub with like your favorite, whether it's tea or a glass of wine, whatever your thing is. And you're like in a bubble bath, to me, a romance novel I love that. I happen to be reading a nonfiction work by a guy who was like a New Yorker writer, Tubin, who wrote about Patty Hearst. Just was interested in what would make somebody from a family like that. She was kidnapped, of course, but what would make her become part of this organization? Because activism is on the rise, sort of in a different way now than it was, say, when she was younger. And so the climate of the country has some, unfortunately, violent or turbulent times. So I just was thinking about that. But I have to say, I will love to read a glossy magazine from the supermarket. Love to see the photos, love to get the stories, love to look at a children's pop-up book, from a time past maybe, but I really enjoy some of those kind of stories too.
I'm addicted to magazines. My husband says I have a subscription to every magazine that's out there, and they show up in our mailboxes every day.
Do you feel like when you're reading a magazine that you're pulled into this world that's created by the magazine, and it's just they're all different and they have their own voice, and so it's fun. It's definitely a fun little escape to read a magazine. I agree.
Do you have another work that you're writing?
I've started writing some themes that may be universal to women, maternal, maybe, I shouldn't say women, actually, to anyone who's a caregiver, but different kinds of identity, different types of thoughts about parenting, thoughts about aging, thoughts about family, and how the constellation changes when there aren't necessarily any kids at home, whether you're alone, whether you're with a partner, whether there's 3 generations in the house, or whether there's another generation nearby. But again, aging and the identity over the course of time may be there. I always say identity is kind of like a kaleidoscope, and there's so much in it. So I'm thinking a lot about identity and how it changes over time. Erik Erikson thought of that. Believe me, I didn't think of identity changing over time. And this is a well-mined area. Gail Sheehy wrote many books about this, but I was trying to think about it, maybe a more modern take, to see if there's anything in terms of the pandemic before and after. And so I'm playing with that and understanding it, from the psychologist's lens, through the psychologist's lens too, and how those things change over the course of a lifetime. And I don't know if it would be essays or if it would be more of a kind of larger issue discussion. I don't know. I think I am thinking, though, that it might not be fiction this time.
It might be interesting for you to analyze authors and why we choose the topics we choose to write about.
That is so interesting. It's true. So now you've given me an idea for a podcast and an idea for a book.
There you go.
Just let me know where I send your, your
commission.
Yeah. And when we should start our podcast, because I'm there. I'm in.
Stephanie, what do you think was the best money you ever spent as a writer?
That's such a good question. I would say that I went the traditional way with the Mad Men book, and I did a book proposal, gave it to the agent, and 3 chapters attached, and the agent made some comments, and then we sent it out, and then I wrote for the editor that bought it. Versus a novel where you kind of have to write your whole novel, and it has to be in better than the best shape. It has to be publishable. So I was really lucky. I blind queried a woman who did developmental edits after I had a draft. My draft was, I think it was terrible, but the blind query was good enough that she said, let me see 30 pages or whatever she said. That she said, I will work with you. And I think paying a developmental editor to make the novel really the best it could be and help. She was brilliant with the pacing, because it's just hard out there. And I think if it's not moving along or really exciting or perfectly honed and imagined, there are just so many talented people out there that you may not get a fair look. It required very little editing once it was actually acquired by a publisher, because to get to that stage, it has to be better than perfect, which I don't know who's listening, but I'm just going to be honest. I'm not F. Scott Fitzgerald or something where the words fly off the pen, people weep, and they just get, I benefit from having a gifted editor. So having a developmental edit and being fortunate enough to find somebody so skilled who's willing to work with me I would say that's the best money. She was worth her weight in gold. If you can't take rejection, no one should be able to do this. You have to have such a thick skin. People say the funniest things, the mean, they're not mean. You can't take it personally. But people say lots of stuff. And if you're prone to getting your feelings hurt, this is not the right endeavor.
Well, you are an expert at giving advice. So I wonder if you have any advice for writers 50 and above.
Okay, right. Advice for writers 50 and above. Well, I would say one thing. I'm reminded of this will be a little wordy, but of the teenager who went to an open house and said, I want to write my memoir. And the memoir instructor who was fielding questions said, you do? How old are you? And the person said, whatever, 19. And they said, thinking, what? The teacher was laughing, like, what would you have to say at that age? When you're 50, you've been around the block. That expression, not your first rodeo, you have a wealth of experience and things to talk about and an interesting life to write about. And I would say that the older, the better. It isn't like being a professional baseball player or something where you're washed up at 35 or whatever it is. You can go on for a long time. Sort of like being a psychologist. The older, the better. A few gray hairs don't bother anybody, and maybe they're an asset. So.
Well, I think that's great advice and a great place for us to end our chat today. And I appreciate your advice so much and your being with us. And we're just happy to say that you're now one of our authors over 50.
Thank you for having me and for your really thoughtful and really interesting questions, not the run-of-the-mill questions. They were special. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Please look for Authors Over 50 every Thursday when we will have conversations with accomplished debut novelists over the age of 50. Please subscribe and share with a friend. And check out my own publication journey after 50 at www.juliadaily, that's DAILY, like dailynewspaper.com. Until next time, keep reading and writing. And remember, it's never too late to fulfill a dream in life's sweetest third.